existential global risks. And we will be presenting our work based on 2 countries, US and Germany. So next slide, please. So to look at the overview quickly, we will start with what artificial intelligence is and how it is developed throughout the time. And then we will give a more detail on different forms of AI and importance of these particular forms of AI and what they mean for our research. And of course, we need to touch one of the main points of our work, that is what is existential risks and what are the approaches that we found on our research. And lastly, we will present our cases on both Germany and US side, and there will be discussions at the end with you guys, and we will address some questions, and we will also like to receive some questions from your side. So next slide, please. So artificial intelligence. What is artificial intelligence? I'm sure most of us in this program already have some knowledge on AI, either it's shallow or deep, but basically AI is a branch of data science that focuses on building smart machines that capable of achieving various tasks that actually requires human intelligence and human cognition. But can we say AI is as intelligent as humans? For intelligence, to speak about intelligence, we need to have some capabilities like having reason, being able to judge and comprehend, understand, perception and sensing, also acquire and apply knowledge and having cognition, be conscious and think, be able to think. So far, AI haven't reached or haven't surpassed the human intelligence. So what will happen if it does it, and if it reaches the singularity beyond which it will continue to improve in a runaway fashion, that human help is not needed. But we don't have such clear answer to that yet. So next slide, please. So how did AI develop so far? AI has come a long way from being a component of science fiction to reality of today, as we have a host of intelligent machines like self-driving cars, chatbots, surgical robots, and many others. But we can take Alan Turing as a starting point, as he suggested. Humans use available information as well as reason in order to solve problems and make decisions. So why can't machines do the same thing? And then he came up with the Turing Test, which is a method of inquiry that artificial intelligence for determining whether or not a computer is capable of thinking like a human being. Throughout the time, AI has flourished and computers are right now more able to store more data, more information, and it became faster and cheaper and more accessible. And machine learning algorithms that also improved a lot, that people got better at knowing which algorithms to apply to their problems, their concerning issues. And also the history of AI may be best understood in the context of its core themes and controversies, as you can see on the box on the right corner. These themes were parts of the discussion on the development of AI, and each side of every issue continues to be strongly representative of today's AI as well. So next one, please. So we need to look at the different forms of AI to understand our question more deeply. First of all, to start with narrow AI. Narrow AI is a goal-oriented, designed to perform on a singular tasks like facial recognition, speech recognition, voice assistance. And why these machines seem very intelligent, but they actually operate under a narrow set of some constraints and limitations. That's why we call them also as weak AI. And narrow AI doesn't mimic or replicate human intelligence. It merely stimulates human behavior based on a narrow range of parameters and context. And secondly, artificial general intelligence, which is also referred as strong AI, deep AI, is the concept of a machine with a general intelligence that mimics human intelligence and behavior, with the ability to learn and also apply their intelligence to solve any kind of problem. In that case, AGI can think, understand, and act in a way that is almost indistinguishable from a human in any given situation. And AI researchers and scientists have to work on this process to make true the AGI, because we still couldn't succeed to make it real so far. And lastly, artificial superintelligence is the hypothetical AI that doesn't just mimic and understand human intelligence and behavior, but also where machines become self-aware and surpass the capacity of human intelligence and ability. And superintelligence has long been as the muse of dystopian science fiction, where robots overrunning and overthrowing and enslaving the humanity. But this concept of artificial superintelligence sees AI as evolving to be like human, and not only understanding the emotion and experiences, but also evoking the emotions and needs and beliefs and desires of their own. So next one, please.
So why is artificial intelligence an important issue? And considering first the narrow sides of artificial intelligence, we need to see it as a phenomenon where the general purpose technology like steam and electricity and the silicon-based chip was actually identified well before its rollout. And it is also a dual use technology, meaning that whatever applications are applied in the civilian side, in AI models and cyber physical systems, these can be somewhat effectively translated into the military applications as well. The main issue with the weaponization of AI is that it could be developed without a physical footprint, meaning that, like for the nuclear weapons, there is a problem of an arms race occurring for this technology, but there are no physical systems that are visible, nor are there detectable materials that are used in its creation. So next slide. AI is salient primarily because of this geopolitical issue. There is a whole framing of in the media and in public policy around an arms race, something that was effectively deemed as a security dilemma that was present in the Cold War concerning the nuclear weapons and the deterrence of opponents by having as much nuclear weapons as possible. And it is also something that the concern was aired by many world leaders across the world, especially since 2016 until today. But it is also an example of an inescapable risk. By ignoring it, a nation cannot escape it, but the common people cannot also identify it without the risk being translated by experts who work on this. And this is an example of a crucial element within the concept of the risk society of early Beck, where experts are the primary mediators of how we understand this risk. And this caution culminated in an open letter on autonomous weapons, which was actually signed by more than 30,000 practitioners. So next slide. Now, considering the general intelligence problem, it is something that is even more speculative and less identified by those who do not work on it. It is widely believed to be achievable among computer scientists and AI developers, and it is also widely believed to lead to general to super intelligence pipeline in a way. The two main problems with this pipeline, to put it that way, is that the orthogonality thesis basically claims that capabilities of such an agent do not converge with what goals it picks. So it does not necessarily have to choose goals that we consider wise or that we consider human-oriented. And there is also the issue of instrumental convergence, where if we try to box in this super intelligence or try to have a system to turn it off at moments where we deem it's dangerous, the system may actually focus on subverting those mechanisms because without being able to function, it cannot achieve any goal, let alone ours or theirs. And this is an issue that was aired by many computer scientists, even not only philosophers and thinkers, and even Alan Turing raised this concern in 1951, but today it's quite a controversial topic. On the next slide, we can actually see that the safety problem is primarily speculative, or the problem of whether instrumental convergence will actually happen or the orthogonality thesis is true. The timeline is also dubious because some have predicted even that the early 2000s would be the catalyzing point for general intelligence, but this did not occur. Some predict now that it would happen by 2045. And as some researchers deem it, it is like considering overpopulation on Mars before we actually reach the planet. This is what can be considered an opposing stance or a dismissive stance on the precautionary principle scale, which basically communicates certain levels of precaution and safety mechanisms to subvert the risk before it actually manifests itself. And on the opposite side of the scale, the strong version of the precautionary principle, which represents moratoria on technological development in terms of artificial intelligence and black box mechanisms, and the weak version, which communicates on the issues of cost-benefit analysis, which place more emphasis on costs. There is actually a salient argument that not considering these risks is scientific myopia, or what is deemed as tunnel vision of scientists who fail to consider potential risks or potential possibilities, like Rutherford did when he published a paper on the impossibility of generating energy from splitting an atom, after which, literally by one day, Szilard, another eminent physicist, found a way to do such a thing. On the next part, we also have to consider why are these existential issues. And with that, we have to consider the Nick Bostrom's definition of existential global risks. These are terminal issues that affect the whole of the human species and, in fact, are not something that we can bounce back from. When considering A&I, this is obviously the arms race, the new Cold War, the catastrophic geopolitical consequence of generating weapons without controlling them. But there's also the issue of amplification of certain materials or properties beyond planetary boundaries, in the sense that, for instance, there is an obvious planetary boundary for CO2 emissions that is currently deemed by scientists to have been surpassed. But if we ever try to address, let's say, climate change as an issue through artificial photosynthesis, if that is even possible, we also run the risk of generating more oxygen in an atmosphere, thereby creating a kind of more flammable environment, as happened in the eras before us. With AGI, this is obviously the issue of value alignment, which means that our values need not necessarily align with another more Machiavellian machine and more utilitarian machine. But there are also the issues of what is deemed as endurable risks. And this is something that Nick Bostrom raises as well, is the question of for whom is it endurable or how local is a terminal risk. And when considering labor disruption, for example, this is something that was a class-based issue that pervaded politics, at least since the French Revolution until the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and indeed is today very salient. But there are also issues with authoritarian purges on both sides of the ideological spectrum. And then, of course, the aspect of high-impact terrorism, which is somewhat endurable, to put it that way, but is not necessarily an environment that we want to, a kind of society of fear that we want to participate in. So, next slide.
So, yeah, our research question is, what is the perception of the US and German government concerning AI as an existential global risk on federal level? And also, what does this risk management framework look like? And by doing that, we are looking at the policies and we are trying to analyze the policy landscapes concerning risks. And at the same time, we focused on the higher level of the government to understand how the policies perceive risks with AI. Next one, please. So our method is, at the beginning we did an initial search and we started very broad. By doing so, we looked at the relevant departments and then we basically constructed a search string based on keywords from the topic that under the investigation, such as artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence, existential risks, precautionary principles, and etc. And in the inclusion part, we filtered out those documents according to their relevance. And we ended up with 25 documents in total. And also we need to mention that we looked at the reports, official reports, not on the press releases or interviews. Also, we used the references for AI and risks, and we used the deductive coding approach because we already had a coding layout, which is a coding legend preset, and we use this preset to analyze different documents to synthesize overall risk perception.
So on the next part, I will just discuss why we chose Germany and the US specifically. And this is something where we can actually see that in the AI development environment, US and Germany are very similar in some respects, but different in others. For example, the level of the US and German AI development is deemed to be high. In fact, the Oxford Insights Readiness Score has deemed them as being high for the past years as well. There's a presence of strategic documents on a federal level covering artificial intelligence as a technology and its impacts. The amount of investment is high. The existence of AI ethics reports is also prevalent in both countries. But also for both countries, the first AI policies were introduced on a federal level in 2019. As far as the differences go, in Germany, the main orientation of the government is to delegate the power to the industry. And while US reflects that concern, in a way to say, as Germany does, it focuses a lot of its efforts on national security. Also, the issues with personal data ownership are in the US solved more by giving power to the private sector, whereas Germany tries to find a middling path between private and public sector ownership of data. And on the next slide, we can actually see what the results of our research were. First of all, we found 17 US policies on the federal level and 8 German policies. Most of these policies were, in US at least, were tended to be optimistic. The technical standardization concept of mitigating risks, of competing with geopolitical adversaries and of bringing opportunities was something that the US policies echoed in many of the positive statements that reflected AI leadership or leadership in the sphere of high technological development. This is something that was reflected by the policy entrepreneurs themselves, primarily Michael Kratsios, who is the US Chief Technological Officer since 2018. He is also the entrepreneur of many of the policy windows which resulted in the AI policies alongside Kelvin Drogemeyer and Russell Watt. But there are also examples of policies in the 2016 Obama administration, which were more preparatory for what has been explored in more recent years. The last point concerns the precautionary principle, which will be discussed later, but there are some some documents where forms of the precautionary principle was evident, but in most of the documents, there were no considerations of such explicit precautions, but rather more standards that could be applied to risk mitigation at a departmental level.
Perfect, thank you. And now we come to Germany as our second country for comparison. And similar to the US, concerning the approach is rather neutral, ranging to optimistic. And the policies are predominantly talking about the opportunities, but also the possible implications of AI. This is something that, is present in all the different policy documents, that AI comes along with risks, but also with a lot of benefits. Similar to the US, we don't have any reference to artificial general intelligence. There are some documents that refer to strong AI, but overall, the current focus is really on the narrow part of artificial intelligence. Concerning the risks, we have different elaboration levels of risks. Predominantly, risks are focused around data privacy, rights of the individual, and also kind of like this the labor sustainability. The principal policy entrepreneurs are the ministers of the different federal ministries, Peter Altmaier, Anja Karliczek, and Hubertus Heil, but we also have two expert commissions that are consisting of member of parliaments and also of industry experts. Concerning the risks, risk perception, as mentioned before, the risk is always coexisting with opportunities, and this is also something that we see in the policies, and we will cover that in a second. The predominant risk mitigation strategy at the moment is to basically to monitor the respective risks and also to review existing governance frameworks. Also, what the key component for the current risk mitigation framework is to develop appropriate measures, but also to educate the public and also to advocate on the EU level. Concerning the precautionary measures, it is quite mixed. I will provide you with three examples in a minute. And the first one I want to explain to you is a risk management framework proposed by the Study Commission on Artificial Intelligence. This commission is consisting of members of parliaments and experts and was created in 2018. And the report or the risk management part starts with a general definition of risk and then shifts over to AI-related risks. And in this and if we look at those risks, these have some kind of overlap with the key requirements or key risks as elaborated on EU level. So transparency basically refers to making the usage of AI in systems visible. So I, as a user, can basically decide whether I want to use the system or not. Reproducibility is the ability to basically check how the system is designed and constructed. And this requires access to the actual system, which can be a little bit tricky if it comes to intellectual property rights of, for example, big companies. And the explainability is basically the characteristic of being able to explain how a particular AI system arrived at a certain decision. Think of a credit loan application. Explainability basically means like which data points an AI system used to determine whether you get or do not get a specific loan. And the Study Commission proposes a two-tier approach similar to the EU level. So in this basically, it means that an AI application is basically rated whether it has a high risk or a low risk. And if an AI application has a high risk, then it needs to comply with a specific set of requirements. And the Study Commission also proposes that the risk assessment should be based on the individual industry area and application environments to determine the criticality. What the criticality means, well, I will cover this in the next slide. And so overall, the management framework by the Study Commission emphasizes this kind of like trade-off, this cost-benefit analysis type of thinking. So always consider what are the costs, what is the effort, and in connection to the potential benefits. And this can also be seen in the last point that I have on the slide, that the audit process to check an AI application needs to always be considered to not limit the degree of innovation, especially for small and medium enterprises and for startups. Next, I would like to give you a quick example or an overview of the risk-adaptive regulatory approach as proposed by the Data Ethics Commission of the German government. This is basically a framework kind of that should be applied to any kind of algorithmic system. An algorithmic system is basically a computer system that uses one or more algorithms to collect and analyze data to arrive or achieve a certain decision. And what criticality basically means that I was referring to on the first slide is the commission basically incorporates the impact of an adverse event plus the probability, but they also incorporate the market dominance and the character of the player. So, for example, think of Google as a big company with a high market dominance and has a higher factor in this kind of calculation. And to give you an idea of how this tier system basically works is that AI systems with a low tier, so with small potential damage, they should be regulated in no kind of sense. And systems that are expected to have unjustifiable damage potential, for example, like autonomous weapons, could be entirely prohibited. And this is basically a risk regulatory approach that has a strong precautionary nature to itself, because it should be applied to any kind of algorithmic system. So the second part that is proposed by the Ethics Commission is the regulation on algorithmic systems. And this is basically a horizontal regulation. And what this is basically that it touches different matters and spans different subject areas. It is not a industry or vertical aligned regulation, but it should be an overarching regulation. And in this sense, the items posed are more of procedural nature and should provide methods and mechanisms to improve the decision-making and development and implementation of legislative measures. And so this regulation basically proposes that on EU level, there should be some kind of principles defined for algorithmic systems. And two of them are human-centric design and sustainability. Human-centric design refers to the fact that the system should be designed around the human who uses the system, and also focused around the humans who are impacted by the decision-making of this particular AI system. And the sustainability part basically refers to or includes a environmental protection part. So this refers to the efficient and effective use of energy and rare earths that are used, for example, to produce chips necessary to run the AI systems. And yes, this is the Germany part. Back to Tomas.
So, considering the examples in the US, there is a salient controversy surrounding how many precautions should the US government take. And as for the superintelligence concept, there is also the precautionary principle to which either one camp adheres or another camp which opposes. And in that sense, we have the common threads of policies in what is considered a conservative pole of these regulations being just as problematic as not regulating AI because of the innovation that it may hamper and the international relations position that it can hurt from the US side. There are also considerations that this risk should be dismissed, or at least in some sense considered as a cost-benefit analysis, simple evaluation of pros and cons. But again, depending on which side the policy entrepreneur to which side the policy entrepreneur leans, also depends the way this cost-benefit analysis is framed. And so, in some policy documents, there are also, for some principles like trustworthiness, there is the issue of benefits outweighing the risks significantly. And there is also the aspect of needing extra precautions to stop certain principles stop certain parts of the technology to be developed until they're provably safe and controllable. On the next point, we have the issues that are found in these risk management frameworks. There are several that are recommended, but none are given because these technicalities are delegated to different departments. Firstly, there is almost no reference to AGI. There are some considerations of AGI as a possibility during the Obama administration, specifically in 2016, when the main policy document on AI preparation was drafted. And in that year, there was also consideration of, even if AGI never manifests itself, there should be some form of monitoring system that is included, especially a form of canary in the coal mine system that will be discussed in a few slides later. There's also the keyword of trustworthiness that occurred during the Trump administration, especially in 2018, which basically presents the principles on the right side that relates mostly to replicability and explainability of artificial narrow intelligence models. Finally, the issues center around opportunities. Everything is created so not to hamper opportunities and innovations. And there are also adversarial concepts that are introduced when considering, for instance, Chinese developments and authoritarian systems, which may develop ANI or in the case of 2016, AGI that threatens the US leadership in the international sphere. Now, on the next point, we have the discussions of the different government policies in the different countries. And firstly, there is the issue of the artificial intelligence race being framed as such. So this is an adversarial remnant of the Cold War fears of nuclear proliferation and the post-Cold War fears that the Soviet nuclear weaponry will reach non-state actors in what is known as a spillover. And this is also something that is salient in the media. And even as a researcher found that 2015 was a salient year, there is still no explanation as to why exactly this year might have been so important for the concept of AI race. There is also the concept of quantum information science and artificial intelligence being seen as separate issues. And although there is an exotic concept of quantum artificial intelligence, or what is essentially an artificial intelligence model on quantum supercomputers, this issue is something that is still conceptual in nature. And even though it does not exist at this point, the policy recommendation, the dominant policy recommendation is that because the investments are so high in both these areas, they should be considered. And in this presentation, we echo that same recommendation as well. For ANI, or artificial narrow intelligence, and existential risks, there is the issue of nationalization of both endurable and existential risks, whether it's a dominance of a system that does not understand the power of the technology, or labor disruption, or similar issues. And this is the same concept that is kind of emblematic in the universal basic income, the question of what is universal. This is what echoes back to the Ulrich Beck's statement that these are inescapable risks that are shared throughout the world. And by considering only the national scope, this is something that requires, and the recommendation is to generate an international outlook, an international conversation around the concept of why AI race exists at all. And finally, in terms of the AGI, there are almost no considerations, but there in the nonprofit sector, in the academic sector, these concepts are quite salient. And even in 2019, the Stockholm Resilience Center proposed that it may include artificial intelligence as one of the aspects to monitor for when considering planetary boundaries, and their framework that they proposed. But there was also a government commissioned study in the US specifically that concerned AGI and the possibility of creating canary in the coal mine detection systems that center around expert opinion and finding new ways of of detecting this type of technology. So, next slide.
Yeah, so to conclude, I believe it is fair to say that both AGI and artificial superintelligence are not freely covered by these both countries, Germany and the United States. And both countries are mostly concentrating on the opportunities. And like just Tomas said, they also still don't want this endurable risks. They are still unwanted. And they both have different approaches to the risks, like my colleagues previously mentioned, but we couldn't find such framing AI as an existential global risks on our research. At this point, I would like to address these two questions, as you are seeing right now. But if you have other questions, please feel free to forward it. Firstly, what would you say about concerning AI as an existential global risk, and how would you frame the issue? And secondly, when we look at this both countries, we look at that they are tackling with AI according to their concerning departments and ministries. And do you think there should be a central department to tackle with AI?
Thank you very much. Maybe we can stop screen sharing mode now. Great, thank you. So, bravo, I see many hands and clapping going on. I'll join you here. Nice presentation. You really spent a lot of time preparing those slides, I think, and collecting the information. So, very, very well done. Let's go now into a discussion round. Are there questions, or would anybody like to take on the questions that Kader proposed in the conclusion? Maybe I can get the discussion started, because I have one question which I was thinking of as I was listening to the presentation, and that is the question of how we look at the existential risk question depending on what the usage of AI might be. So AI for health as opposed to AI for banking, or AI for all kinds of business activities on the one hand, and AI for military purposes, AI for terrorist purposes on the other. And there, I think an important question might also be the ability to do counter AI intelligence or counter AI protection. So we have hackers, and then we have safety experts, security experts. Is there any such discussion going on related to AI?
So, in terms of the US discussions and general academic discussions, this is a somewhat salient issue because no detection models can actually be developed and introduced without considering the cat and mouse game, to put it that way, because these are similar models, similar issues as with the zero-day exploits, with the any kind of software. This issue with monitoring AI development is somewhat dubious because there is no specific framework on which people agree and which could introduce these concepts that are also not controversial. So one example is the introduction of a treaty that would actually force governments to declare certain behaviors, let's say in using lethal autonomous weapon systems, or in applying, let's say, AI in banking systems or so on. And this is not something that has been resolved as of yet. There is kind of a general academic sense that there should be a treaty, but in terms of the policy discussions, it's not something that is addressed beyond the OECD principles that kind of emerged on building reliable AI and so on. So that's just one part of your question, I think.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that or any questions in the room?
Can I jump in?
Sure, Zafar.
So the reason why there is not much framework or research regarding it related to existential global risks is which I believe is because it's rather still seen as a tool in technologies, not a technology within itself. Of course it is, but the way I see it is that it can lead into a way where it can become an existential global risk, but since it's a tool used in technologies, it's rather the technologies that are addressed whether the technology itself can be an existential global risk, such as nanotechnology, for example. So, and when we have such a powerful tool, immediately what we do, of course, is we are careful, right? We don't want to lead it into certain directions where it is implemented in technologies that are ultimately can bring our end. But so I think rather than working on a framework around AI and how it can be regulated, I think there should be a framework about how it is implemented in technologies itself.
So do one of you want to respond to that?
Maybe just a short comment that I agree. That's why it's kind of called a general purpose technology, like the steam industrial revolution was based on steam engines, electricity, and so on for the second revolution. But the main issue with AI is, in essence, that it's difficult to coordinate these different departments, and that you may actually reach certain models that are effective on a wide area, but that are still inexplainable. So in that sense, that's kind of the reason that there is this consideration of a very specific, how to put it that way, not an agency, but looking at AI as a specific entity in itself because of the general applicability of certain models.
Shunlong or Kader, anything to add?
Well, for example, the study commission basically agrees with what Zafar said, that they perceive AI as kind of like a tool that, depends on its use, which has different implications and also require different risk assessments, which is why the risk management framework proposed by the study commission is focused around the individual industry and the individual environment of the application. In that sense, they basically also, if you kind of go into the direction of perceiving it really as a risk, and depending on where it's used, it should be treated differently. And maybe referring back to the first part of your question, Miranda. Existential risk in AI, I think they're connected on different levels. So, for example, at the beginning, we have this model with the three different types of AI, right? So we have the narrow AI, with the strong AI, and the AGI. And in literature, from my perspective, so for example, by Link Bostrom, he basically puts AGI or strong AI in the context of existential global risks. But I agree with you to say that also within this within the narrow bucket, you have specific applications of AI, for example, maybe in nuclear, or also, as we mentioned, in autonomous weapons, where we also need to basically put AI in context of existential global risk, and really need to think about that. And right now, I think this kind of thinking is quite scattered around, or we are basically approaching this kind of research of AI as existential global risk from different perspectives. So there are some research really focusing more on the superintelligence part, and then there are, I think, less research. They're approaching the A&I part of artificial intelligence. But yes, definitely, we need a kind of more diverse view on this emerging technology as a global risk.
Zafar, you had your hand up again.
Yeah, just something I wanted to ask. So, to Long and Thomas and Kader who presented it. So you mentioned the regulation around and a framework around AI, but if we were to regulate AI, as you mentioned, it can be used in autonomous weapons, etc. But shouldn't it be these technologies itself that should be regulated? Because I feel when we're talking about regulating AI, it sounds to me as similar to something like regulating work on math, for example. Because in fact, it's just purely models completely based on high-level mathematics and coding, right? And obviously big data. So if we start to regulate how people create those models, etc., I think we are really limiting our creativity in ways where we can use AI in very good things as well, right? So I think rather than trying to come up with restrictions on those, we have to address like people working on acquiring data in a non-legal way from people, or people implementing models in technologies which are not good at all, etc.
I mean, I would like to say that while regulating AI, I think we should also, like, we will also be regulating those technologies that we are using within the AI, right? So these technologies take their power from the AI because they are built within the AI. And the problem is related to AI, not the technology itself, because it takes power from that. For example, we are talking about like autonomous weapon systems that they detect the enemies according to the algorithms that they are fed, that they are being input. And if the algorithms are biased, then you could end up being dangerous to such particular, ethnicities and so on. So I think at the end, we, like as human beings, we always want to be able to like control and be able to prevent any unwanted events that might AI bring. That would be my point of view.
Yeah, but something I want to oppose that. So you mentioned again autonomous weapons, but I don't think that it's a whole different system than just image recognition, which is also used in detection of cancer cells in human body, etc. Right? So basically, it's not a very different model. It's just a very different way of implementation. So if we were to try to regulate the models that are being created and how people use their power of mathematics and coding in developing those algorithms, then we're also limiting all those other autonomous stuff which is being created, like autonomous driving, autonomous death and this. So again, I definitely agree that they get the power from AI, so there could be a framework around it. But still, again, if we were to dig too much into it, and if we were to put restrictions on the creation of those models, which are also very similar to models used in very good technologies, but they just have different labels, right? It's just that in the autonomous weapon, it's labeling those images as enemies, and in another application, it's labeling something. I think you get the idea that I'm trying to.
Yeah, I got it. But like my answer is still because I don't think there is such like regulation exists right now that can cover every negative side of existing AI, and also for the future AI, artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence. I agree that these arguments, these discussions might prevent like a further development, but at the same time, we didn't do anything such regulations on today non-existent artificial superintelligence and general intelligence. And people are still working on it. And as we covered today in our presentation, both countries, both very powerful countries like US and Germany, they both like trying to advance their technologies in this way, but they still didn't do any regulations. So long. Tomas, would you like to address some answers to the first question?
Yeah, I think I would just give a bit of context in terms of that I agree that blanket regulation would be quite bad, and it's an issue that is represented by more extreme precautionary groups, but it's not a mainstream opinion or mainstream flow, because the main issue is actually regulating it like you would regulate CBRN technologies, so chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons, for example. You're not regulating the technology itself. You're not saying that nuclear is bad no matter where it's applied. You still have medical applications. You still have applications in a variety of different departments. In chemical, even chemical weapons are allowed to a certain extent in riot policing, but if you're regulating a specific manifestation of that technology, let's say widely distributed chemical weapon, as an example, you're still regulating some forms of it. So in chemistry, you're regulating toxins. There are some possibly beneficial ways of using toxins, but you're still regulating the specific aspects where they manifest themselves, and you have a document specifically directed to that purpose. And in that sense, when discussing these issues around AIs, you are discussing in a way models that have a certain maybe margin of error of beneficial applications, but that are provably in at least a certain period of time that are provably only applied to, let's say, lethal autonomous weapons or systems that disrupt critical infrastructure and so on. So in essence, you're not saying, by having good regulation, you're not saying let's ban artificial narrow intelligence in whatever. You're not doing the blanket regulation. You're just saying, okay, this specific manifestation of the software model will, in 95% of the cases, result in malicious applications. So we have to do something about it, regardless whether there's 5% in, let's say, applicable in industrial safety or medicine and so on. I mean, not regardless, but for that piece of regulation, it's important to consider.
Felix has been very patient with his hand here. Do you want to jump in the conversation?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for this really interesting presentation. I was just wondering, in general, how would you see the approach towards AI? AI has become such a buzzword, and we hear it so frequently everywhere, and saying, "Oh, AI is so dangerous," and so on. And here we also hear about the problems. And Elon Musk, that quote is quite famous, but Elon Musk is known for also putting tweets out there which are not so to be taken so serious. Isn't it, since we also discuss global threats, isn't it a huge opportunity and approach of this carefulness? And as you, Thomas, said, it's, as what I understood, it's a bit of a tool, and it depends on that you regulate how you use it. But the approach toward this whole AI buzzword and not being a tool that enables us to address so many of those global risks, if if the data is properly structured and used and made, then so many we've heard about many examples in previous classes. Just your general idea of the approach towards AI, and if that is the right approach from the German and the US government. Thank you.
Maybe Shun, do you want to start?
Yeah, I was thinking about so your question is basically whether we think that the US or Germany or governments in general are approaching AI correctly?
Yes, it's this buzzword and it's this fear along that we can hear. And if the emphasizes it's, and that it is such a, that it could be such a great tool and bring us so much forward, but it is a bit this technology fear of future improvements in technology. And how you just personally, just on a personal note, think of the approach you all have read in deep towards the US and Germany.
Yeah. I think, like, for example, I speak now for Germany and what I see in Germany right now. So the German strategy to AI is a little bit late. So kind of like Germany is a little bit late to the party. Like if you, for example, compare it to China, the US, or for example Israel, they were much earlier to invest serious money into AI research. I must say that concerning this kind of like technocratic fear, maybe towards AI, I think the overall like sentiment of the federal government is quite positive. So they see like a lot of opportunities in AI and they invest also a lot of money. Like until 2025, I think they're investing 3 billion euros into AI research, building this whole AI research cluster, and they want to become one of the leading AI research centers in the world. And I think Germany is quite on a good way to get there, because they're putting so much money into educating and also educating the public, and also to strengthen their research their research infrastructure. At the same time, what is quite positive is that with Germany, you have a very, positively polled player in the EU, because like the EU is a relatively big market on the world, and they are basically transporting this kind of positive sentiment also to the EU level. So I think they are quite on the good way, but a little bit late. Like if you, for example, compare it to the US. Does that answer your question?
And I would also like to add that Germany, when it comes to Germany and implementing AI integrating AI into their systems, I think they are also lacking in terms of the military part. I knew the proper answer to that. I think it's because like a very regulatory thing that when they decided to like implement AI into their systems, I think there was this like ministerial division that Defense Ministry didn't take part of the agreements that when they were doing it, and that's why like a military part is quite lacking, and they mostly focus on the economic part, especially that they want to preserve this Mittelstand, small businesses against the other international giants with usage of the AI. And yeah, I would also like to add that.
Jeffrey, you have your hand up.
Yes, related to the previous question about fear, I would also like to ask a question. We saw recently with the assassination in Iran of Fakhrizadeh that the Iranian government claimed that this assassination was only possible because of some weapon that was powered by AI. But then quickly scientists and academics around the world announced that this was, improbable, or in fact, just, spurious. So, people who are critical of that kind of thing in the news and who are aware of what scientists respond, they're in perhaps no danger of being misinformed. But I'm sure there are great sections of the population all around the world who would indeed believe that this is some mysterious artificial intelligence that is capable of carrying out that kind of assassination. So my question would be, what do you think of misinformation in general regarding AI, the fear that this can fuel, and do you think that this kind of that there should be some approach to mitigate misinformation within regulation for AI?
Who would like to take on that question?
I can say something. I think most of the misinformation occurs because of the lack of proper information on what is AI and how does it work and how do we develop it and so on. And I don't know how to regulate that first of all, but I am so sure that if we educate people and inform them, there will be less these kind of scenarios out there, or at least we would be able to evaluate whether this could really happen or this will never happen. So.
Okay, so if I listen to this discussion, one of the things I think we're hearing here is a question of is regulation a good thing, yes or no? That was one discussion we had. And there I heard, on the one hand, if you regulate, then perhaps you are restricting the uses of a technology. And on the other hand, if you regulate, perhaps you are helping to prevent unexpected, unintended, or intended negative consequences. I think a follow-up very important question is, can we assure that regulation actually addresses the people who are most likely to use a technology in a questionable way, in a terrorist form, or in some kind of form that is meant to harm others or to gain personal benefit, like bank robbery through AI? So one question is whether or not you can actually effectively regulate a technology like this one. I don't know if you guys can answer that, but that's something to think about. I think something else you might want to think about is from the theoretical perspectives, how would different theorists go with this question? So if you were Ulrich Beck, you would probably raise the question about how is it that we're developing a technology without having sufficient regulation during the process? Are we essentially developing a technology that could lead to unforeseen consequences? Maybe a little along the lines of Elon Musk. And what other kind of theoretical perspectives? Some who might say, in fact, this is not something we really need to pay too much attention to, because there will be a natural set of checks and balances. Excuse me. So those are some general things for you to think about. And in the meantime, I see there's some things going on in the chat here. Zafar, I think that the fear comes with it because of the misinformation, exactly like Jeffrey raised in his comments. Kader, do you want to say something? You are lit up.
No,